Hmm. So, Ukraine, Russia. So, Russia and China are both criticizing the United States' actions in Venezuela, a criticism that I actually do share, as you saw in my previous video. However, Russia and China both look extremely hypocritical. So, of course, we all know what Russia has been doing in Ukraine. So, in 2014, Russia literally from its bases on the coast of Crimea went in and took over administration of the Crimean Peninsula, an area that has long been recognized as a part of Ukraine and was recognized as a part of Ukraine on its independence. And it was kind of funny because I was actually on a 3-day family vacation in Kending in southern Taiwan. And because it was the Taiwanese Peace Memorial Day, so it was a 3-day weekend. And so I wasn't paying attention to the news at all, which is highly unusual for me. And so when I was driving the car back to Taichung and heard the news that Russian troops had taken over Crimea, it was a huge shock. And of course, we all know that since then, the world has changed. So, what also happened in the ensuing months was that Russia essentially started separatist movements in Donetsk and Luhansk. There was no separatist movement in those regions, okay, prior to Russian involvement. Okay. These are secessionist movements that were sparked by the Russian government. There's no group, no legitimate group within those regions that can represent any kind of independence sentiment. So what happened was, as Ukraine was gaining the upper hand against those forces, Russian regular forces went in to bolster the dictatorial regimes that then existed in the Donbass region. Russia then accused Ukraine of violating the Minsk Accords. But in reality, it was Russia who was violating the Minsk Accords because its troops were still in the Donbass region, which was a violation of those accords. So, what about Ukraine? Okay, what about its history? So, Ukraine had been part of the Russian Empire for quite some time, as were many other territories that had been conquered by the Russians over centuries. So, what happened after World War One was Russia lost. Yeah, Russia lost World War One to the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians, and so they were forced to sign the treaties of Brest-Litovsk. So in those treaties, Russia gave up a significant amount of territory on its western flank, territories that would later become Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. Most of Poland came out of that territory, a little bit of Czechoslovakia, as well as what became the Soviet republics of Belarusia and Ukraine. So now, after Germany lost in the West with the Treaty of Versailles, uh, parts of those treaties were abrogated, but not the territorial clauses. Russia did not regain those territorial clauses as a consequence of Germany losing the war. Those territories became the states that I had just mentioned. And in fact, in 1920, the Treaty of Tartu, yeah, it defined the borders between the Soviet Union and Soviet Russia and Soviet Ukraine, as well as the borders of Poland, most of which was carved out of former Russian territory. And the Treaty of Riga, 1921, in which Russia explicitly recognized the independence of both Estonia and Finland. The independence of the other states involved, Estonia and Latvia, were also recognized in the absence of formal treaties to that effect. So, not only that, was when the founding of the USSR occurred, Ukraine and Belarusia were both regarded as founding states of the USSR, and within the Soviet system were regarded as sovereign states. Now, in practice, that wasn't the case, but in the Soviet system, they were. So much so that when the United Nations was formed, both the Ukrainian and Belarusian Soviet Socialist republics gained full membership in the United Nations, and Ukraine had even held a position on the UN Security Council. So, 1954. That was when Crimea was transferred from the Russian Soviet Federated Socialist Republic to the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. Now, some have noted that that was illegal under the laws of the USSR. However, as far as international law is concerned, that is an internal Soviet affair. And so, and that'll become relevant later when the states that were part of the Soviet Union become independent, which happened in 1991 in the case of Ukraine. The illegally annexed republics, so-called republics, of the Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, had regained their independence early, but those were never legally a part of the USSR in the first place. So, after Ukraine declared its independence, you had the Beloshiko Accords on December 8, 1991. So, in that treaty, Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus agreed to respect the territorial integrity and inviolability of borders of each of those three republics. Basically, meaning that they all recognized the borders that each of them had under the Soviet system. On December 5th, 1994, was the Budapest Memorandum, in which Russia agreed to respect the borders of, among other states, Ukraine, which is obviously something that they have not adhered to. On May 28th, 1997, the Partition Treaty on the States and Conditions of the Black Sea Fleet. In that treaty, Russia implicitly recognized that Crimea was in fact Ukrainian territory. And later that year, on the Treaty of Friendship, Cooperation, and Partnership on May 31, 1997, Russia promised to respect the inviolability of the borders of Ukraine. What does international law have to say about this? It's actually very clear. Under international law, when a state falls apart or parts of it become independent, the borders of the administrative regions within that state do not change. The borders that existed pre-independence do not change upon independence. We saw this when Yugoslavia broke apart. When Yugoslavia broke apart, Serbia, Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Macedonia, now called North Macedonia, Slovenia, those states retained the borders that they had had within the larger state of Yugoslavia. The borders did not change. Though, of course, there was a pretty bloody war in Bosnia and Herzegovina where they tried to change those borders, but in the end, they were not. This is a status that was recognized under international law, and there's actually an ICJ case, an International Court of Justice case, that reaffirms this principle. It's Burkina Faso versus Mali, 1986. Both Burkina Faso and Mali, Burkina Faso, formerly known as Upper Volta or Haute Volta, were under French colonial rule, and they were subdivisions within the French administration. And so when they gained independence, there was a territorial dispute regarding the boundary of those two states. The ICJ stated that the principle of uti possidetis juris applied. This was a doctrine that had actually been created more than a century and a half earlier in Spanish South America. When the states of Spanish South America broke up, at least at the time that they became independent, the borders under the Spanish administration were the borders that were held upon independence. Now, after that, of course, ratified treaties significantly altered many of those borders, including Bolivia losing access to the sea after the War of the Pacific. But those changes were conducted by virtue of ratified treaties. But upon independence, the Spanish administrative borders held and became the borders of the newly independent states. And so this was something that was true under international law when Czechoslovakia broke up into Czech Republic, now sometimes called Czechia, and Slovakia, Slovak Republic. Same thing, the borders held. So, 2014, Russia invaded Crimea. Blatant violation of the UN Charter and international law. They then held a sham referendum, also illegal under international law. We can actually see that the ICJ rendered an opinion regarding referenda that are held under the circumstances of illegal occupations. Because when Kosovo issued a unilateral declaration of independence, the United Nations Security Council asked for an advisory opinion on the legality of that unilateral declaration of independence. The ICJ concluded that it was, in fact, a legal declaration because the area was not under an illegal occupation. The court noted that Kosovo was under the UN mandated administration, something that was created by the UN Security Council. not an illegal occupation, as contrast so to, for example, the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus, also called Northern Cyprus, and Southern Rhodesia, okay, now known as Zimbabwe. Okay. Both of those had referenda, but they were in under the condition of the unlawful use of force, which is exactly the situation in Crimea. It was under an illegal occupation by the Russian army. The Russians also administered referenda in the Donbass region. Those were a farce. They were not fair. They were not free. And they also violated the Constitution of Ukraine. So if you're going to have a referendum on independence, you need to follow the laws and the Constitution of the existing state, which is Ukraine, which Russia had assured that it would respect the borders of. 2022, Russia launched a full-scale invasion. Putin and others have since been indicted by the International Criminal Court on war crimes charges. Even though Russia is not a party to the court, Ukraine became a full member of the court on January 1st, 2025. And in both 2014 and 2015, they gave ICC jurisdiction over its territory. So actions that are taking place over the territory of Ukraine are subject to the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court. Now, some critics of the United States and NATO say, well, NATO has expanded to the borders of Russia. Well, quite frankly, I don't blame those states. Now, particularly Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, and others for wanting to become members of NATO because all of them, Finland included, even though Finland didn't become a member until the most recent Russian aggression, all of them had been subject to Russian aggression, occupation, and domination for various lengths of time to various degrees in the past. And so they saw membership in NATO as a bulwark for their security. So there is the notion that NATO agreed that it would not expand eastward. This is a complete and total farce. What did happen was that there was discussions about NATO forces in the eastern part of Germany upon German unification. There was not an overarching discussion about whether or not states may choose to join NATO of their own free will, which is what they have done. And in fact, in 1997, on the NATO Russia Founding Act, Russia and NATO acknowledged that all states had the right to secure their own alliances for the protection of their own security. That opened up the way for the eastward expansion of NATO. It has always been the case under international law that a sovereign state may seek out security assistance and security alliances to protect its own security and sovereignty. Ukraine has that right just as much as anybody else, as do Belarus, though they choose to remain with Russia, and that is their right, okay, under international law. But it is equally the right of in international law of Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, and yes, Ukraine to do exactly the same thing. So even though, yes, what happened with the United States and Venezuela is definitely worthy of condemnation, but let's see the pot and then call the kettle black. Because what Russia has done in Ukraine is actually far, far more egregious than anything that the United States has done in Venezuela, as contemptible as the means of ousting an illegitimate president in Venezuela was.